Cumberland County is a large section of land in Nova Scotia, Canada, jutting into the Bay of Fundy. Thickly forested, its history is made up primarily of logging, mining, and shipbuilding, with its southern shore producing famous ships including the infamous Mary Celeste, previously explored on this channel. But on its north shore once sat a thriving community, now erased from most modern maps. We're exploring the site of an old logging camp and mill, and the small town that was built around it. There's not much left here to actually see, but there are countless stories to uncover and tell. This is the town of Shulie. Three men were given land grants near the mouth of the Shulie River between 1846 and 1854, but it was the third man, a James Patterson, who actually did something with the grant. He and his two brothers moved into the forest with nothing but axes and basic tools and began carving out a town for themselves. Once the settlement was somewhat developed, they brought their families in and began a lumber export business. Thus, the town of Shulie was born. Where the word Shulie originated from is unclear, but it's likely of French origin. The first European settlers in the area were the French Acadians. All throughout the area are layers underground of graphite and other minerals that the French found and mined, selling it off to larger French-Canadian cities. They called this layer sous-lit, meaning underbed. Shulie likely became anglicized to Shulie. The logging business in Shulie was small and family-owned for about 15 years, when in 1879, the industry was bought by J.T. Smith and Chapman, who poured money into expanding it, although the Pattersons remained involved with the company and Shulie itself for the rest of their lives. The new owners, Smith and Chapman, turned Shulie into the largest exporter of lumber in Cumberland County, shipping 500,000 feet of lumber to the United States. Along this riverbank here, they built a wharf as well as a large lumber mill, and that mill was the heart of the Shulie community. Today, in the heat, humidity, and swarms of bugs, we're exploring what little remains of this once thriving community alongside Fred Priest, who was a descendant of several residents of Shulie. He also happens to be my wife's grandfather.
My name's Fred Priest, and my great-great-grandfather was Tom Priest. He lived in Shulie and ran a blacksmith shop there.
Tom Priest was one of the first people to move to Shulie after the logging company's establishment. Born in England and a blacksmith by trade, Tom was given a shop and did any sort of metal work that the town and company needed. You know where their shop was?
Yeah.
And it was right down by the bridge?
Yeah, on the left-hand side there.
Okay. The blacksmith shop was located just across the river from the mill, on the western side. Fred's great-grandfather was Thomas Priest. He was a blacksmith here. And we're trying to find anything, foundation, any sort of remnant of the blacksmith shop. An old blacksmith shop from the 1800s. Just out here at a lumber camp. It would have been wooden foundations, a wooden frame, wooden construction. So chances are there wouldn't be anything left. So we are on a bit of a wild goose chase, but you never know. Finding anything down there, Mark?
Yeah, there's some square.
Oh, I'll be right down. I'm out here exploring with my father-in-law, Mark. That's not him, that's his dog. Hello, Ewan. That one's him. What you finding?
Random squares. More square than you would expect to see.
Huh. Something could have been here. Or they were cutting rocks out. I had hoped that we would find some foundations, but we did at least find evidence of someone having once been here. walking along the highway here, and I see this in the woods, this post. This wooden post. It could simply just be an old mile marker. But let's get up there and see if we can figure out what it actually is. C24 NO Crown 2004. Looking overhead, we can see how little remains of the whole area. The current highway runs pretty much along the path of the old Shulie Road. It crossed the Shulie River here atop a large dam simply called Big Dam. Today it's just a normal bridge, but we can see the embankments for Big Dam on either side. So this was the old dam, which the road went across. This was a massive construction for this little town. It's documented that during one of the flood seasons, the dam partially collapsed, taking the life of one of the men below it. The blacksmith shop was here, and the mill was here, powered by the water flowing downstream. The wharf was built here, slightly downstream from the mill. The riverbank under the wharf was reinforced with logs. This is likely where a lot of the lumber ships would have come in and loaded up. Of course, at the flood tide, when the tide is in, and this is more than just a creek, and it's actually a flooded area which ships fully laden can get in and out of. But this pier foundation seems to be the only remaining significant structure from when Shulie was an active town. It's visible in at least 2 historic photos of the town and still stands strong as the river trickles past it today. Smith and Chapman also built a schooner, the only vessel of significance built here. This schooner was called the Electric Light and would serve as the company's own lumber hauler. Little is known about the ship or its fate, but it was 108 feet long and registered 250 tons. This ship was one of the many ships that transported goods into Shulie and hauled lumber out. The process of loading the wood aboard a sailing ship and delivering it was expensive and inefficient, but it was the tried and true method of reliably exporting lumber. Along the wharf, young boys of about 10 or 12 would assist in loading the lumber onto these vessels. One of these kids later recalled that the Canadian captains coming into Shulie never paid them any mind, but the ones from the United States often threw them candy or tobacco.
Now there was 2 young fellers. The old guy that was running the lumber ship come in, loaded a load of lumber, and 2 of his men quit, got other jobs, so he hired these 2 young fellers to go to New York with him, and that was going to be his last run. He was going to retire, and he was going to leave the ship in New York, but they loaded and went up around towards New Brunswick there out, and they run into a great big storm, and the ship busted in 2. They didn't get her into shore, and they was all lost. I guess it was a sad Christmas here in Shulie that year.
37 years old, lost at sea, 1912. Think that might be from that ship?
Yeah, could have been.
Sailing these lumber ships was arduous, and the actual transportation of lumber by boat was costly. But across the Bay of Fundy in St. John, New Brunswick, an inventor patented a new idea of how to ship the logs to the United States that was quicker, cheaper, and allegedly easier. If the logs are floated down the river for milling, why not float them all the way to delivery? In 1887, this was put to the test. Using lumber from all across the county, but mostly from Shulie, a massive bundle of logs was assembled using chains. This truly was massive. I'm talking the size of an ocean liner, nearly 600 feet long with a girth of 150 feet and weighing 15,000 tons. It contained over 1 million feet of wood. This was put together a little to the east of Shulie near a town called Joggins. The raft collapsed during construction but was rebuilt.
They couldn't get it off of the shore. It didn't want to.
Oh, man.
So they had to wait till the next year, and they put, I don't know how many more thousand logs with it, and then got her afloat.
This reconstruction was launched successfully, being towed by 2 tugs out to sea and to the south. Unfortunately, right in the middle of the shipping lanes, the raft began to break apart and the tugboats cut it loose. A lot of money lost.
Well, they all had them insured. No, the Larry Logg, the old guy that had it insured for $30,000 back then.
The raft was attempted again the following year, built to the same dimensions, and successfully floated into New York City harbor. This transport method ended up saving over $10,000 in shipping costs, and turning a profit of $21,000. Despite the success, this was the one and only time that a raft of this caliber was made from here. So what did your grandfather do?
He just helped build it.
Tom Priest continued as one of the town's 2 blacksmiths for many years, marrying a woman named Elida Hoig and having 7 kids, including a Tom and Jessie Priest, whom we'll learn about shortly. But the old blacksmith Tom Priest Sr. died in 1897. He was buried in Trinity Cemetery in River Hebert, about 45 minutes east of Shulie, and was eventually joined by his wife. Tom Priest Jr. and Jessie Priest both continued on as lumbermen in Shulie. In 1902, the main logging interests of Shulie were sold to an American group, Robinson and Wright and Company, who invested in modernizing the steam boilers of the mill and other heavy equipment, as well as the overall infrastructure of the company and town. By 1904, the lumber in the area around the mill and the town of Shulie had been thoroughly harvested, and the company needed to expand outward. 3 dams were built along the Shulie River. The first one was known as Big Dam, which we talked about earlier, and was built immediately above the mill site. The next one up was known as the Mitten Dam, about 3 miles upriver. The third dam was known as Coffin Dam, built 8 miles above the mill. The new logging routine was as follows. A lumbering team spent the winter 8 miles out of town, working 5 days a week to cut down the trees. On the weekends, they'd hike the 8 miles back to town and see their families before returning Sunday night. Work in this remote logging camp outside of Shulie was hard, and at times dangerous. Now, Fred didn't work here, but he worked at a similar logging camp only a few decades later, and has some stories himself.
Me and Charles was working, my brother was up there on the game sanctuary in River Hebert, and he went out and he had one of them Irving 5-gallon cans, and I don't know if it had gas in it before, but he put kerosene oil in it. And we come in at night, and I had a roast of meat in the oven, the old stove, and wasn't burning very good, so I tipped the can up to dump some in, and it caught the can. And before I could throw it out the door, it blew up, blew the bottom right out of it, knocked me down. When I come to, the whole camp was on fire. The ceiling, the fire was falling off of the roof of the camp. So I got up and run out through the camp and drove my head in an old mattress in the raspberry bushes and put the fire out.
Winter was spent cutting down trees and gathering them in this holding area 8 miles out of town. One winter it snowed so bad that the logging camp itself became cut off. Running low on food, the men were forced to shovel the 8 miles back to town, rationing their food and trying not to freeze to death. They made it, and that of course was not the norm. When things were running more routinely, each April as the thawing snow created a steady stream of water flowing down the river, it was time to drive the logs from the logging site and back to the mill. The water was stored up at Coffin Dam and the logs placed in the reservoir. Once all was ready, the dam was opened and the logs drove violently down the swelling Shulie River. 2 men were given the duty of driving these logs, Rupert Milton and Tom Priest Jr. They built themselves a crude raft among the logs and rowed it down to Mitten Dam, where the lumber was held until it could be milled in town. Now, while Tom was riding the raft down the river, his brother Jesse was courting a young lady named Dolly Patterson. They were in love and planned to marry. Despite the loud and tireless lumbering along the river, Shulie had a thriving domestic area. Stretching up from the mill along the main road was the town itself. There were various houses and a post office on the south side of the road. They were also visited occasionally by traveling merchants. The main downtown had a handful of small shops and even a small hotel for people passing through.
But the row of houses was all up this side of the...
Yeah. All the...
They covered 2 or 3 acres,
Yeah.
the village. But right at the bridge there was a big warehouse and cookhouse and a hotel.
Continuing up the hill was the school. Obviously, this was the town's educational institute for the children, but this building doubled as the town's Friday evening dance hall. But that wasn't all. Now, the schoolhouse also doubled as the community church. The Methodists and the Baptists, which made up the community, both shared the schoolhouse, and they had their own ministers who traveled to the different communities and would occasionally stop here in Shulie. Jesse Priest and Dolly Patterson were likely married in the Shulie schoolhouse, the first night of their marriage being rudely interrupted by rambunctious neighbors congregating outside of the house and firing off pistols, a Shulie tradition. They had their first kid in 1887, but tragically, Dolly died giving birth to her second child, a daughter, who also didn't make it.
How old was she?
21.
Yeah, it could be then.
Dolly and her daughter are buried together in the cemetery behind where the schoolhouse once stood.
My grandfather's childhood sweetheart, see, I think she died at childbirth. That's what he told my sister Jane there anyway.
Jesse eventually remarried a Mary Warren and became a mariner, sailing in and out of Shulie, even being shipwrecked at least 4 different times. Jesse's story is one that I'd love to go into in another video if I can find more information about it. He went on to have children who went on to have children as well, and one of his grandkids is Fred. Jesse died in 1952. The Shulie Cemetery likely has the bodies of over 100 people buried in it. I found an old photograph. It actually shows the cemetery coming out to here. I think they got rid of a bunch.
There's likely a lot of graves right here. I bet you there's an old...
That's one.
Yeah.
While there was that photograph proving that more stones came out from where they are now, I suspected that there were other graves in the grove of trees behind the cemetery. I walked into the wooded area, which quickly came to a tall cliff overlooking the mouth of the Shulie River, where I made an unfortunate discovery. And I'm exploring in there, and I actually found wooden crosses with names on them that have fallen down the cliff. I don't know if that is erosion, or if somebody just kicked them and tossed them in. Probably the latter, because I don't think there'd be very much erosion up here. Yeah, there's a good number of crosses down there. All sorts of other ones dumped here. There's no name. Audrey Jean Green. I did some digging online and found that this is Audrey Jean Greer, not Green, a 4-month-old baby who died the next town over. Fortunately, their grave is not lost. They actually have a proper stone placed in the Shulie Cemetery that I didn't catch on my first visit. This whole time, the cemetery was located in the plot just behind the schoolhouse, which was still being used as a church. Eventually, they managed to raise enough funds to erect a proper church, and that stood right by the school and the cemetery. The land in front of the cemetery sort of rolls and dips and rises into a hill, and it sort of looks like the base of old buildings, the foundations buried under the dirt. We can assume that both the school and the church likely stood on this plot of land right here. Back at the bottom of the cliff, we're following the river out to the mouth. At the mouth of the river on the east side was a forge and a secondary wharf. the foundations of which still stand. On the other side of the river, a lighthouse was erected, but it burned down in the 1950s.
Trying to get down to where the forge was, and the mud is real bad. It's actually almost easier to walk in the water. Found this piece buried in the mud. We're not too far from where the forge was located. In fact, we could be right on the location. The maps are very vague. And I don't know what this piece could be. It's metal. And it's got bolts. But I don't know what it could be. If you have any idea what it might be, why don't you drop a comment? Let me know your thoughts. Old timber.
From this spot in 1919, the workers in the area of the forge and the lower wharf were treated to a peculiar sight out of the river and on the Bay of Fundy. A house was floating by. This was such a strange sight that the workers stopped what they were doing and ran to the shore. It sat atop a raft and was being pulled by a tugboat. This house belonged to a Mr. Goldstein. He was moving his house up from Advocate to the southwest, to Joggins to the east of Shulie, along with his wife, his hens, and all of his property. Rather than ship everything separately, he just stored all of that inside of the house, including his wife, and shipped it by sea. The story goes that the wife was even baking bread in the oven as the house was pulled up the coast. The house made it to Joggins successfully. I've read that it is across from the old Joggins liquor store.
So we're in Joggins. This is where the liquor store was. So that house might be the blue one, might be one of these two white ones.
The mail was brought into Shulie by a team of horsemen. A rail line was built into Joggins which carried the daily mail for the area, and the Mill brothers picked it up at the station and then brought it back to Shulie.
The liveliest lady of Shulie was a woman named Alice Colburn. She was born around 1867 and seems to have been the younger sister of Dolly Patterson, the first wife of Jesse Priest. Alice was hospitable to everybody who lived in Shulie or was visiting. Alice kept herself busy organizing church fundraisers, running a boarding house, having special guests for dinner, acting as one of the town's nurses, as well as one of the town's postmasters, as the logging company's summer cook, all while raising her 12 kids, as well as her 5 grandkids after they were orphaned. This tough lady who helped hold the community together died in 1957 and is buried in River Hibbert, not too far from where Tom Priest Sr. was buried.
In 1924, the sawmill was sold to the Hollingsworth Company, who never actually did anything with it. The sawmill shut down immediately and the townsfolk just moved on.
The last people to leave were the Crandall Patterson family, actually descendants of the original town founders, but they finally left as well in 1929.
The ruins of the town were picked over, with several of the structures being completely dismantled and moved up to Joggins. It would be great to be able to track down which buildings in Joggins came from Shulie, but that would not be an easy task. Shulie was a completely abandoned ghost town for decades, although summer cottages have been popping up along the highway in the area in recent years.
The town has seen a slight resurgence as well. It now has 2 permanent residents in recent years.
The cemetery is forgotten and rarely visited.
This whole grove of trees along here was actually clear-cut at the time, and that's where dozens and dozens of houses and shops once stood. In 100 years since the town was abandoned, it's completely grown back in.
To see any hint of the once bustling town of 200 people, you really need to stop, walk off the highway, and look hard. Even then, there's hardly a trace of the people who were born here, toiled on the riverbank and in the forested hills, who danced in the schoolhouse and married there too, who sailed from this wharf, who wrecked off these shores, and who died in this small, forgotten settlement. A special thank you to the Age of Sail Museum in Port Greville, Nova Scotia, for once again opening their archives to me for this project, as they did with my Mary Celeste documentary. If you're visiting Cumberland County and have any interest in maritime history, the Age of Sail Museum is a must. For further reading on Shulie, an excellent book is Shulie, The Way It Was, by Evelyn Gautreaux. If you enjoyed this video and want to explore more forgotten history and lost towns, be sure to subscribe to my channel. You can also check out my Patreon at the link below. A special thank you to my patrons, especially Marlo Perez, Kelly Black, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Kaiser Friedrich III, Zach Richards, Donald Anderson, Cody Henricks, Joan Haynes, Sean Kimball, Glenn Biddiscombe, Stephen Schwankert, Gabrielle Colombe, Nick K, RGB, Tara Molokar, Keith Holland, Miles Garrett, Jennifer, Rob M, Amos Mayhew, Corey Andrews, Nicholas Masella, Colt Hannock, Sophie Baber, Rob, Oliver Chin-Chen, John Miluski, David Watipka, Tiffany Raridan, Mad Time Media, Nathan Gutierrez, Max Metcalf, David Littlejohn, Sean Sahi Fraser, Nikki Chan 92, and Matthew Burns.